Hey, everybody. Whereas before we'd been working with World War II, and before that Japan, and then before that Hitler, and before that Mussolini. Of course, Hitler and Mussolini were both right wing regimes, and that meant they were very conservative. On the political spectrum, if you remember doing that a million times in class this year, then you would remember that whereas the extreme right end politically is fascism, the extreme left end, of course, is communism. So, it's important to have some understanding of how a left wing regime operates. And so for that, we have an example, about, 100 and some odd miles south of us in Cuba. And that's what we're going to look at for part one today. Part two is going to be more about what happens once Castro is in power. So we're going to get started with the background on things today, and then go forward from there. So things to think about. Why does he come to power when he does? What are the kinds of things that propel him to office? What does he offer people? Hitler made offers to people. Made suggestions. So did Mussolini. How does he get that message across to people? How does he make sure they understand what it is that he's going to do once he's in power? How does he take power? How does he maintain power? How does he get rid of his opposition? And to what extent was he in total control? A totalitarian leader is a question that we should be able to answer by the time this is all done. So background wise, Spain owned Cuba, like it did a majority of Latin and South America, dating back to the 1500s. And in 1898, Spain still had it. Spain was just a shadow of its former self. They had some colonies around the world. They really, really were weak and powerless. They were nothing like what they were in the 1500s, and they were getting lots of riches out of places by now. England is the supreme power, of course, in 1898. And the United States and Spain are going to get into a war, and it's going to be a really inventive title called the Spanish-American War. And it takes place 1898, 1899. And as a result of that, as one of the major reasons why, the United States actually gets notices what's going on in Cuba, the type of administration going on down there. They don't like what they see. For example, there are actual concentration camps, not like extermination camps, but, people who are having uprisings against the Spanish regime are being essentially held against their will. There's lots of other things that go on, but there's a war that ultimately the U.S. will win. And we pick up Guam, and we pick up Puerto Rico, and we pick up the Philippines, and we also pick up Cuba. But early on, we say, well, we're not intending to keep Cuba. We're going to give it back to its people. As you can see, sorry, I'm waiting for the Mountain Dew to kick in. The U.S. was there until 1903. And then we turned it back over to the Cuban people, and we said, all right, we reserve the right to come back in there militarily if something's unstable, if something we don't like. That we can show up there and influence things, which we would later, do a few times. As part of the conditions of coming over, we did, kind of make ourselves a sweetheart deal. And that's the fact that, there were U.S. sugar growers, and they had a limited amount of production, but the world market itself was very competitive. And we agreed that we would reduce our tariff on sugar from Cuba by 20%, which guaranteed they'd have a constant guaranteed market, which also guaranteed that we would have supply of sugar. Yay. And so because they never had to worry about markets or anything like that, they said, well, we're just going to make sugar basically. And that's dominated Cuba ever since. That term over there, the monoculture, there's one thing they generally grow, much like the American South prior to the Civil War was very much into cotton. Cuba has, pretty much lived and died by, sugar production, and that's not necessarily a good thing, as you're probably aware. And overdependence on one particular type of product or crop is going to be dangerous. But as part of us reducing our tariff to give them guaranteed access to American markets, and we would charge Jamaica or Barbados or any other country, more money on a tariff, making their product more expensive. But Cuba got, a preference. And in response to that, they were obligated to buy as many American goods as possible. And so our finished goods would go down there. Raw goods would come from there. Of course, we're going to make a lot more money off of this arrangement. But that's not exactly unusual. They did also have, some coffee, and I'm sure some of you enjoy Cuban coffee. There was some tobacco, and you probably heard of Cuban cigars. a little bit of rice production as well. But for the most part, it was these raw products that they grew that were going out, not a lot of finished goods. And again, think about the American South and how much money they were not making prior to the Civil War. They were definitely at a disadvantage economically trying to advance. So they needed to trade for things that other people had, oil being one of them. And in a modern world in the 1900s, you're going to need oil for cars or for planes or ships or anything like that. And unfortunately, they just didn't make a whole lot of money as a whole. So when it came time to join the 20th century and put in things like gas systems, like distribution of gasoline, electricity, putting in telephone poles too, but electrical poles, wiring the whole country and everything else. These are hugely expensive things that are beyond the capability of anybody in Cuba to do. They're just not making enough money internally. So foreign companies are coming in there. They're getting sweetheart deals, and they're being told, if you give us the monopoly on electricity, we can charge what we want. We'll electrify the whole island, or we'll put in telephone lines all across the island, or railways, or banks, or other things. And so these hugely profitable things that were the people depended upon to move goods, services, and themselves were all foreign owned, which meant that a lot of money that needed to be made in Cuba was being made in profits that were going to leave the country. The trickle-down effects to the Cuban people just really weren't present very much. So as a result, the people got paid what these foreign companies wanted them to get paid, which wasn't a lot. It also was a very seasonal work. I mean, obviously, a lot of people worked in agriculture, and there's a downtime in agriculture, but also, consider when, it's super wet and rainy, it's really probably hard to go out and string electrical poles. So during that part of the year, that we're used to, we'll call it May to like July, it's going to be hard to get a lot of stuff done because every day there's the rolling in thunderstorms kind of things. Outside the cities, it was also really difficult to spread telephone lines, electrical lines, and a modern plumbing system, simply because there are some mountains, and we see it every year in hurricane season where we sit there and we really, really hope and pray that as major systems are coming towards us, that they're going to get torn apart by the mountainy part of Cuba in the eastern end. But, because it's not level, flat, easy ground, a lot of people live in cities, and that's really easy to string something between two houses. But when you're out in the rural area, it's a lot harder to string electrical lines, when you're going to have to go 2 miles to one guy's house over this way and 3 miles to go one guy's house over that way. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive. And as a result, that level of modernization outside the cities just really wasn't there. That also, compounded the issue with education. And, you had people in Cuba who weren't getting a strong education system simply because, again, nobody wanted to go out where if you were educated, you're like, I'd rather live in the city and be a teacher. I'll have electricity, I'll have water, I'll have, modern this and that. Why would I want to go out in the countryside? And they really suffered. Illiteracy in general, dominated the countryside and held back their progress as well. You can't read a technical manual. Maybe you can't sign a contract. Maybe you don't know what you're signing. And so obviously the people who could read, write, and were, in control of everything were the people who were tied to politics and the economic system. Those individuals dominated everything. And they generally wanted to see the rules kept that way because it obviously benefited them. So in general, there was very little change that was going on in Cuba from 1903 up until the time of Castro. Basically, corruption was normal. Governments ruled to satisfy those who were rich, foreign interests as well. The military kind of played along with what was going on. But during the war in 44, they kind of would put their guy up who'd make them happy, and they also got paid a lot. You remember, one thing that dictators like to do, or regimes like this like to do to keep people under control, is they like to arm the military because, people who have the guns, they're going to support them if they get paid well. Finally in 1952, there's a name that's important here. I'm going to move my head. But this guy you see down here, Colonel Fulgencio Batista, is going to engineer a coup. He's going to take over power in the country, and he's going to be the guy that ultimately is the one that Castro will overthrow. And Batista's going to be the last, these pre-communist leaders, and we'll see why it is that Castro wants him gone in just a second. He's out for a moment. He's in, longer than that up until 59. But, corruption just got worse. I mean, you can look at the guy right here. He looks like some sort of, dictator type thing going on, lots of medals and everything else he's awarding himself and whatnot. But something that began to get really big in the 1950s, in Las Vegas and elsewhere, would be essentially organized crime, the mafia, the mob. And about the 1950s, if you were rich and famous in the United States, one of the places you could go, because Las Vegas is just getting started at that point, one of the places you can go is Cuba. And it seems like anything goes down there, and the beaches are great, everything is cheap. And, the organized crime folks want to come down there because of the amazing beaches and everything else. And they want to create these hotels and casinos that are going to make them tons of money. And in order to get permission to do that, in order to get permission to essentially run things and run things their way, they're going to bribe all these top Cuban officials. And that includes Batista. And again, more money is being made in Cuba, but going into the hands of foreigners and not going for the benefit of the people. About this time, more people are also growing sugar. And as you can remember, when there's more of a supply of something, obviously its value goes down as its scarcity goes down. So, when the price of sugar goes down in the world market, well, you're going to pay Cuba what the world market price is. And a farmer who's used to making, and I'm just using this as a number, say, $1,000 a year, is suddenly making 800. It's going to be harder to pay your mortgage. It's going to be harder to buy your supplies. It's going to be harder to get by. And those things that you need, oil, additional food, or other supplies, medicines, are going to be very expensive to import. And as a result, it's going to lead to a much lower quality of life unless you're rich, unless you're bribed, unless, you're corrupt, in which case, your friends are going to make sure you got what you want because you're making the system work for them. So during 52 to 59, when Batista has his heyday, if you want to call it that, 60% of the population has an education of third grade or less. And what that really means, a third grader today, for instance, could pick up an iPad or a computer and do a lot of things with it that a third grader in my day could not do. Now, obviously, a third grader back in the 50s, never seen a computer before, and the skills that a third grader had then are even lower than what we would see today. But that means their education system, their illiteracy rate is going to be very limited. It's going to potentially mean that people don't have a chance to improve their situation much through education, getting a college degree and becoming a specialist and maybe inventing things or something. As you can see, only 1.1% of the population graduated from college. Now, I can say realistically, the expectation when I was graduating from high school was that people should go to college, but there still was an interest in trade programs, and that's not a problem. Again, I say it every time, the air conditioning guy, who comes out to bail us out when we're sweating to death and we need him, makes more than I do. And the car mechanic potentially can make more than I do. And I have 2 degrees. But 1.1% of the population graduated from college. What does that mean about doctors? What does that mean about teachers? What does that mean about lawyers and judges? You're going to have a hard time finding people to do some very important functions, to keep people, in society moving forward. So unemployment in general is going to be difficult. People who try to move to the city, there's only so many farmers that can tend a piece of land. There's only so much land on an island. They move to the city, and again, there's just not a lot of jobs. 16% unemployment, 16% is pretty significant. Up until recently in the United States, we had less than 5, which economists would say is full employment. Underemployment, look at me as an example. If I have, 2 college degrees and a partial third, and I want to go work at McDonald's because I can't find anything else, that is underemployment. That is somebody who's way qualified for something else, taking a job that is really not challenging their abilities or using their skills in order to make some money. So 16% unemployment, 13% underemployment. You can imagine, people are desperate for jobs and they're desperate for money. So, that also translates into food, constant figure for me. The thing on the bottom says citizens, and again, especially more in the cities, because if you're rural, you can grow your own. but less than half of the calories you're supposed to get is a typical diet. So that's going to lead to malnutrition. It's going to lead to vitamin deficiencies. It's going to lead to other medical issues that are going on, which again, with few doctors, is going to make it very hard for the Cuban people to really keep their heads above water. So it's going to be a really difficult situation. And again, turning a blind eye to all this is the elites who can afford doctors, who can get all the food they want, who, are getting paid off essentially. So the upper classes, as the economy is going down, they're seeing that they can't buy as much stuff. They're not making as much money as they did before, and they're kind of resentful about that. They're kind of looking around, why is this? Oh, it must be Batista. The fact that, again, people weren't able to buy much, things like that, economic uncertainty by the business owners, the urban workers, unemployed, underemployed, seeing inflation because, the government's trying to handle things poorly. Student groups don't like being told what to do, what to think, and so forth by the government. Okay, that's my wife texting. And of course, the rural people want education. They want housing. They want electricity. They want water. And the government's not delivering anything. So you've got every single social group essentially, turning against the regime. And that's obviously not going to be good. There are three major political parties that are going to start to develop, and they kind of have a same theme. One's the Authentic Party. The Authentic Party wants socialism, not pure communism. They want to nationalize some key things. They like the idea of unions. They were corrupt. Okay, a little bit more to the left is the Orthodox Party. It says integrity against money. They don't like corruption. They're trying to expose it all, which of course is going to make them targets from the government. They want to nationalize, which means the government will take over U.S.-owned businesses. Think of it like a Holiday Inn on the beach. That would be the Cuban government taking it over and potentially not paying off Holiday Inn for their investment. They bought the land, they built the property, they built the structure, they trained the workers. They made all these investments, and they're just going to come in and go, sorry, we're taking it over. That's what the Orthodox Party wants to happen with U.S.-owned businesses. And Castro had been a part of this previously. Whereas the PSP was just flat out communist, and the government banned them because, again, the people getting paid off are in favor of capitalism. But remember, it's a warped sense of capitalism because, they're being paid off. So they don't want to go to communism where the government owns everything and everybody is equal and everybody shares things. They don't want to share their toys. They've got nice things because they've been paid off. So Castro himself is the son of a sugar plantation owner, although he is an illegitimate son, and he has not a lot of contact with his dad, but his dad does make sure he's got a really good education. He goes to Catholic schools. He's going to go to law school, graduate. And while there, he's going to, of course, hear about what the norm should be. And he becomes, boy, I'm drawing a blank on the term here, but somebody who really wants to see the perfect world and everything, and he doesn't see it. And I'm sure all of you are going, oh, it's this word, but I can't hear you right now. So thanks a lot for that. But he's going to look at what the world should be, at least in his mind, and he's not going to like what he sees. So he's going to get into radical politics. He may or may not have been involved in killing a couple of people, doesn't go to jail for it, doesn't have any real consequences. When he graduates, he becomes a candidate for a seat in the Cuban parliament. And at first he's a supporter of Batista, a little bit, but he's going to kind of say, no, I don't think so. Whoops, went too far. Batista's not doing what the people want, not what the people need. Here's a guy, Castro, who is economically not too bad off. He's a lawyer by background, but he throws his lot in with the people, and he says, this really isn't the way it should be. He's an idealist. That's the word I was looking for. And he's going to try and do something about it. In 1953, he and some supporters are going to attack a military base. Let's think about it for a moment. What's a bad idea? Going to attack a military base. Let's see. What do they have on the military base? maybe they have guns and maybe they have soldiers who are trained to use them. And yeah, okay, that's his idea. So he's going to go and attack these barracks. And the barracks themselves get all shot up, but his people get essentially stopped. Now, if you go to Cuba, it's something they want you to go to on the tourist circuit because it's like associated with the rise of Fidel. He goes on trial, and while he's on trial, well, he's going to get his name out there a little bit more. Another part of this, a couple years later, is going to be when he's going to leave the island temporarily, come back on a ship called the Grandma. There's an in-country guerrilla movement, and finally that guerrilla movement's going to take power. So those are the three stages, essentially. Get your name recognition out there, start agitating, and then, take over. So this, whoops, there's a picture. The Moncada Barracks, as you can see over here, is, let me see, can I do this? Woo, look at that. You see all the bullet holes all over the building. Again, those are still there because they want people to come in and, see this place associated with the great Fidel. But they're going to attack a rather significant military base and a place where these soldiers are housed. And it's going to be quickly squashed. He's captured. He's going to go on trial. And he's got this rather famous speech. History will absolve me. It's much like Hitler does, except in this case, he's a left-wing guy and Hitler's a right-wing guy. And he says, hey, you know what? Later on, history's going to judge my actions to be what was necessary at the time. I did what was best for the Cuban people, unlike, Batista and everything else. He's allowed to give this big old speech. And remember, he's got a law school background, so he's probably got some ability to use argumentation well. They actually are going to copy down word for word what is said, and they're going to print it in a book form, which is what you see over there on the left-hand side. And that, much like Mein Kampf with Hitler, is going to be what raises lots of money for Castro's political movement. And so he's going to get 15 years in prison. And he starts dreaming while he's in prison, much like Hitler again. Mein Kampf says, I'm going to do this if I'm in charge, or I'm going to do that if I'm in charge. He has lots of time on his hands to start thinking up some plans. And he says, I'm going to go to Mexico, and I'm going to raise this group of freedom fighters, and we're going to come back to Cuba and take over, and blah, 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 blah. After less than 2 years, there's a general amnesty. There's this worldwide criticism of what the Cuban government's political prisoner system looks like. And Batista's trying to show he's not a bad guy, trying to keep his international support. So he says, all right, I'm going to let go my political prisoners. Castro's one. He goes to Mexico. And you're never going to believe this, but he starts forming a group of followers. And he says, we're going to eventually go and take things over in Cuba and get rid of Batista, which, of course, is exactly what he wanted to do in the beginning. So he forms this movement. It's called the 26th of July movement. If you're wondering why it's called the 26th of July movement, well, I'll give you a hint. Notice the day that the attack on the Moncada barracks took place. Woo, look at that. So he is going to form this group. That's their flag over here on the side. It's really inventive, I know. But they're going to, a lot of them are going to be in Mexico. Those that are not, that are supportive of Castro, are going to do like low-level underground, kind of like sabotage-y kind of things, just to frustrate the Batista folks. What that does is it gives Batista the idea there's people working against him, and he's going to crack down more and more and more, which again leads to more people going, wow, Castro's not going to do that if he's in charge. So what Castro is going to suggest is that what Cuba really needs are some reforms that will make it better for everybody. The land, which had been held by the rich, because they were able to buy it up, the land is going to be distributed amongst all the peasants. People can share more or less equally. Public services, we're talking about, again, telephones, we're talking railroads, we're talking electricity, we're talking water. All those kinds of things are going to be nationalized and run by the government for the benefit of the people as opposed to the benefit of the shareholders of the foreign companies. There's going to be more industrialization because, again, the country is dependent upon sugar production, and that's not something that's going to allow them to pay their bills in a modern economy very well. And he also, of course, wants to see elections that are honest, which is ironic given what happens later. And he wants to see the education system improved such to the extent that the people will be able to sort of lift themselves out of the economic despair they're in, and then ultimately, be more successful. So in 1956, the second stage of things, he's gonna get on this boat. It's actually a yacht. I don't know how he got it, but he did. He's going to get this yacht called the Grandma. No, it's not Grandma. It's Grandma. No D. And they're going to get stuffed onto this yacht. And they all basically, sail across the Gulf of Mexico, and they arrive in Cuba. And as soon as they arrive, basically the Cuban military is there waiting for them. And they get into a gun battle. Only 12 people out of the 82 are going to survive. That includes Fidel, his brother Raul, and Che Guevara. They're going to basically be the only survivors. These 12 individuals. They go up into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and it doesn't seem like 12 guys are going to be the vanguard of a new revolution, but that's what's going to happen. He's going to live amongst the poor. He is going to live like the poor. He's going to share their hardships. He's going to share whatever resources his group's got. He's going to start making radio broadcasts to the people saying, are you tired of being abused? Are you tired of not being able to spell your name? Are you tired of this, that, and the other thing? And of course, people are going to tune in to hear it. They're going to be like, oh, an alternative, and he's going to start gathering some supporters. They're going to start, moving towards the mountains where he is and linking up with him. And meanwhile, he and these original other 11 guys, but also these new recruit guys, are going to go out and do like guerrilla, hits on like army installations. So, they can maybe get some more weapons or some more ammunition or some more food or some more medicine or other things. And there are these little, guerrilla attacks, attacking here, there, and then running away, so that ultimately they've got what they need to be successful. Very important thing. This is actually, I think, a brilliant thing that Castro does. Here you see him surrounded by people, and that may be just a propaganda-oriented thing, but specifically, he told the people who followed him, we're not going to steal food from the peasants. You might be sitting there with a gun, and it might be real easy to steal food from the peasants. Remember, they don't have enough food themselves. And if you're going to steal food from the poor, then why would they want to follow you? Why? I mean, if the Batista folks were kind of acting that same way, why would you do the same things that the people you're trying to overthrow were doing? So you always had to pay for food. If it was given to you, that's one thing, but you always pay for your food. Women are not, second-class citizens; they're equals. You don't abuse them. When the doctors who worked with Castro's freedom fighters were done taking care of any injuries they might have received, they took care of the people who, again, normally had no medical support. The people were being taught to read and write, which again opened up whole new worlds to them. If there was like a village they were living in, if there was something that needed to be done, trash collection or who knows what, again, Castro's supporters did these kinds of things, shared the same burdens, and were respected by the people for that. As a result, they saw a clear difference between what he offered and what Batista's folks did. Any one of Castro's followers who didn't follow these rules, was put to death. And, it's something that was practiced simply because they wanted to make sure that they gathered support of the people, not alienating them. So this is the last slide we're going to do in this presentation. By now, Batista sees kind of where things are headed, and he realizes it's not a good thing. There's a whole lot more support growing for Castro during this 6-year period. And as a result, he's going to be, arresting a whole lot of people going, I heard you supported Castro, or I heard you did this. And he's going to just be, crazy at this point, trying to stop his rival from being successful. Lots of people getting arrested, lots of people getting tortured, lots of people getting executed. Again, all that does is drive people towards Castro more and more and more. The people are going to be just sick and tired of the way Batista's people abuse their authority, or how Batista himself abuses it. Tired of not seeing any economic benefits come to them, like from the casinos, the hotels, etc. He's going to send Batista is going to send his troops up into the mountains in this last big push to go, snuff out, Castro and his threat. Well, some of his soldiers, meaning Batista's soldiers, actually go into the mountains, and they're like, dude, we want to join you guys. We like how you guys operate. And they become essentially soldiers for Castro. He's got thousands of people who are following him. And again, in a country the size of Cuba, it's not very wide, so he basically divides this group up into two. And let me see, they're going to go the other way. So you see it. So they're going to come, they're coming all right, whatever. They're going to come from the east towards the west in two large groups and put pressure on Havana, where, of course, Batista's holding out, realizing he doesn't have any supporters where anywhere, really. He's going to flee the country on January 1st of 59, taking a large amount of money out of the Cuban treasury with him. And he's going to go to Spain, and he's going to go to Miami, and he's going to live the rest of his life in luxury, and he'll die eventually, and his wife will continue to live in luxury. And she died just a few years ago. But, essentially, his mismanagement of the situation, his toadying up to foreign powers and everything else is going to lead to his downfall instead of worrying about his people's needs. And on January 1st of 59, he leaves the country, and that enters the door or opens the door for Castro to enter into Havana and take charge as he wants to. So that's this first half. I'll put the second half up very soon. You can watch that at your leisure. Just make sure you get the assignment done.